Hey everybody, it's Jesse here from Finsweet, and today I have a really important topic to cover, and it's a topic of how to navigate conflict with clients.
That's effing sweet.
This is something that we all deal with, both in work, navigating conflict with clients, and then in our personal kind of daily relationships, just navigating daily conflict with other people. So I'm really excited to share some insights and then hopefully some helpful tools that I use personally, as well as some insights from our project management team here at Finsweet. I'm going to talk about what conflict is, where it comes from, how to avoid it, because it is going to come, what to do when it does come, and then share a couple of real stories from our internal project management team. So let's jump right in. Now, before we talk about what to do with conflict once it's looking us in the face, let's lay some groundwork for what conflict actually is and where it comes from. So the truth about conflict, what is it? What is conflict anyways? What I found is that the work of managing clients at kind of a high level is really about managing everyone's expectations as much as possible. And as we know, this is, of course, impossible to do 100% of the time. So all we can do is work as hard as we can to bring as much clarity as possible, and then have tools in place, which we're going to talk about a few of those today, to navigate the conflict when it does come. So really the question is not conflict or no conflict, because we are going to have conflict. It's how much and for how long. So we'll dive into these a little bit. Now let's look at a couple definitions of conflict. Wikipedia defines conflict as a struggle and a clash of interest, opinion, or even principles. And Wikipedia says conflict will always be found in society. It's kind of looming there. Another definition, Oxford Languages, they say that conflict is a serious disagreement or argument, typically a protracted or prolonged one. So these kind of words are important. We'll dive into those in a minute. So what do we know from this? Conflict is inevitable. We're humans. We're not perfect. We mess up, some of us more than others, but that's okay. Conflict is going to come. And so what do we do about it when it does come? In fact, here's something interesting. Every time we start a new project, we're actually opening up the door for a new opportunity of conflict to come. So what do we do with this information? If conflict is almost always guaranteed when working with clients, then what's the approach? And I think the first step is to understand where conflict comes from. So we just talked a little bit about managing expectations. And so I think a key point is most conflict is created in the gap between expectations and perceived reality. This is really important. It's the gap between our expectations or our client's expectations and the perceived reality. I think perceived reality is almost more important than the actual reality when we're kind of navigating conflict sometimes, because it's about, what we perceive to be true or what the client perceives to be true. And then the work of managing conflict is aligning with our expectations with the actual reality of the situation. So conflict has two parts. The first part is the issue at hand, and then the second is the time taken to address that issue. Let's dive into this a little bit. Part one is the issue. Let's look back at Wikipedia's definition here of conflict. It says it's a struggle and a clash of interest, opinion, or even principles. These are important here. So what is this telling us? That issues arise when expectations around interest, opinion, or principle are not met on one side or the other. So think about these words: interest, opinion, principle. Interests could be, what are my expectations for, what this project is going to provide in terms of value for me or for the client? The client might be thinking, we've rebranded. We have this new website that we want you to help us build. And this is really kind of going to help us prove ourselves in the market. So that's their interest. Maybe you have some misalignment on that interest. Opinion could be, maybe we have an opinion that it's best to communicate through Slack. The client may have an opinion that it's best to communicate through Teams. So these are kind of opinions. And the last one is principle. Think values. What is a value that we hold, maybe I hold as a freelancer, or my business holds as a company? Does it align or misalign with the clients that we're working with? Misalignments and, missing that gap between expectation and reality is often going to come up in these three areas: interest, opinion, and principle. Let's look at part 2, time. That next definition from Oxford Languages, they define conflict as a serious disagreement or argument, typically a protracted or prolonged one. So it's talking about time. It's not just about the existence of a disagreement or an argument. It's about how long that disagreement or argument has been left unsettled. Think about, the times that you've navigated conflict in the past. I'm sure you can agree with me that when you've left a conflict unsettled for a longer period of time, that conflict only grew. And I think it's a rare case when, so we hear the saying, time heals all wounds. I don't think it's always true. I think time sometimes does actually make things worse. So really, when we're looking at conflict is coming in the form of an issue, and then also the time taken to address that issue. So that's what conflict is. And this is kind of where it comes from. Let's look at the third piece here. How do we reduce the possibility of conflict? We know that conflict from, our looking at the definition is that conflict is inevitable. It's going to come. It's pretty much promised. Wikipedia said it's always found in society, which is kind of scary, but it's okay. So what we can do is actually reduce the possibility of conflict coming our way. So here are a couple ways that we can do that. One is to establish rules of engagement. I have a fun client story to tell. Really, we're looking at these types of questions. Who does what? What's the cadence of communication? Who is communication coming from and to? And who do we ask questions to? If I have a question about X, who do I ask? If the client has a question about something specific, who on my team do they ask? Another one, when we have an update to push to the site, do you as the agency or freelancer, or even the client, have a process that needs to be followed? This comes into play a lot when you're thinking about pushing code, custom code to a site. Is there some sort of process that needs to be followed there? These are your rules of engagement. I think about a client we had where we just weren't aligning on their expectations around communication. We had this weekly stand-up with the client, and everything seemed to be going great. We, on the Finsweet side, felt like we were, showing up. This was, we were meeting their expectation of a weekly stand-up. And we came to find out after talking with the client that they felt out of the loop. They felt like they couldn't get a good enough picture of the work being completed with just, the amount of communication that was being held. And so we actually sat down with them and established these rules of engagement. We put together a formal document, and they kind of led the charge on this, which was amazing, super helpful. And we listed out all of these exact things that I'm talking about. Who does what? Are we on this particular project? We had 2 developers. Most of the work was JavaScript work, and then there was some Webflow work. And then I was a project manager on the project. And so, out of the 3 people, who does what? So we knew that one of our devs was solely focused on JavaScript. The other was focused on JavaScript and then some Webflow work. And then me, I was focused on, project management, managing the account, that kind of thing. And then we were also talking about, who do we communicate to? Who does the client need to communicate to? One example would be if they had a question about a specific ticket that needed to be completed. Who should they reach out to? Do they communicate through me as the project manager, or do they communicate directly to the developer? So these are kind of questions that were left unanswered at the beginning. And so, we sat down with them and we established these rules of engagement. And honestly, from that point on, the relationship was way, way better because we had our expectations set and we knew the expectations of both parties. Um, we were able to meet those expectations and create the reality that actually lined up with the expectations from both sides. So establish rules of engagement. The next thing to do is communicate clearly and often or frequently. I think this one's kind of obvious, but it's also, something we forget about from time to time. So this comes back to cadence. We've found at Finsweet that either daily or biweekly updates through Slack are helpful for most of our clients. So this is what fits the bill. This is kind of the practice that we hold with most of our clients. Now, some, like the client I was just explaining, they might need a daily stand-up, and that's okay. One of our, one thing that I found out is that higher cadence in communicated updates leads to more clarity and less need for longer meetings. So they initially reached out and they were like, hey, let's have a daily stand-up. It'll be 15 minutes. We're just going to get aligned on the work being done. And then, we'll break and complete the work needed for that day. And my initial impression, my initial kind of like gut reaction was like, oh man, we're going to have so many meetings. But these little stand-ups actually helped us so much with this client in particular, because we were able to all just constantly and consistently be on the same page with everything. And so when we, would jump on, sometimes our meeting would be 2-3 minutes just because we were already aligned on everything and each person knew exactly what they were doing and who they would need to communicate what they were doing to. So cadence is really important. Another thing with communication, at Finsweet, we tend to prefer written communication. And why? Because it serves as a record and it can be consumed much more efficiently than oral communication or even sometimes a Loom video. Think about it. When you're scanning or reading a document or a book, you can often read through that much, much quicker than you would listening to, somebody talk and read out that exact piece of text. Because in your head, you can actually scan and read a bit faster. So that's one of the big reasons we prefer written communication. Now, that said, there are definitely times when a Loom video or a quick call have their place. We just try to, when we use these things, make sure they are the best form of communication for the thing that needs to be delivered, and make them efficient and effective. So that's communication. The third one, which kind of bleeds into rules of engagement, is to share responsibilities of your team. So share the team's areas of responsibility. This kind of got into rules of engagement for us specifically with that client I was talking about. As soon as we were able to establish, like, okay, for us, we don't have a very traditional project manager role. It's almost closer to like a traditional account manager. And then in some cases, it does bleed into a more kind of oversight role where they are, in the weeds with daily tasks. But typically, we would not navigate that way. We would navigate more as, hey, you can connect directly with your developer for daily communication, task-related communication. And we didn't communicate that specific role set clearly enough with the client. And so that brought up this little bit piece of conflict. But once we laid out the groundwork of like, hey, you don't have to come through the project manager every time you need help with something. You can go directly to the developer. That helped a ton because they knew exactly where they were going. They weren't expecting a reply from the project manager. They could just go directly to the developer and get the issue handled. So that's a big one. Perfect. So that's how to manage expectations, how to reduce the possibility of conflict. Now, what do we do about conflict when it does arise? It's here. What now? So I actually connected with our team. So a big shout out to Ovi, who's one of our brand new project managers on the team. He shared a little framework that I really liked. So I'm going to share it with you guys and then add in my own thoughts as well. But this is kind of an approach that he uses, and then some thoughts from our team as well on how to manage conflict when it does actually arise. So the first, really, this is going to break into 4 pieces. So imagine, empathize, be generous, and be curious. These are 4 kind of steps and approach that you guys can take and work, today if you run into a conflict with a client. So let's dive into the first one. Imagine. What are all of the possible reasons for why the client or myself, as the agency or the freelancer, what are all these reasons for, the potential behavior that either myself or the client is acting in? You have to put yourself in their shoes. So why are we expecting something that is not actually happening? Imagine this. Very practical. What you can do when you're in this step is to make a list. You could literally write down every reason you could think, why is, maybe the client comes to you and they have an issue with billing. They're not pumped. They expected something, but they got invoices in a different way than they expected. So what are all the possible reasons, and this could be a short list relatively, what are all the possible reasons that they are expecting something different? And you can write all these down. And what that's going to help you do is to see the issue from their shoes, from their seat. And so that's step 1, to imagine. Step 2 is to empathize. So really this is about getting into their shoes. Now that you've created this list, whether literally writing down a list or created this list in your head, now you can take that list and step into their shoes. So sometimes this is kind of fun. Sometimes this actually means realizing that the client or the other party doesn't know some of the things that you know, context. This in itself could be the source of conflict resolution. I think that, in a developer kind of client relationship, this type of thing does come up, fairly often if communication is not really well done. Think, for example, you have this really technical piece that you need to build, and you as a developer might know the entire context around, okay, here's why we need to do this, and this piece connects to this. And the client may not know the entire technical context of what needs to be done in the approach. And so a lot of times we might assume that they know, and maybe we're unknowingly assuming that they also know this context. But a lot of times they may not know that context. And so they might have questions that were like, oh, we would have assumed that you would have known this. And just communicating, even potentially things that you may not even think about, is a really, really helpful thing to do. If you are finding it hard to empathize, you can ask your client for a call. This is really practical, and just have them tell you their perspective and their frustration. So if you do have this call, make it completely about listening. And as you're kind of working through this step of empathize, when you are empathizing, act with patience and humility. Why? Why is this important? Because in a lot of cases, when you're navigating conflict actually leads to a better relationship than before. Think about the story of the client that I just shared. We have this conflict come up. They didn't feel like they had a big enough picture or a good enough picture of the work that was being done. We set some rules of engagement. We approached the conflict. We worked through it, and then our relationship was way better. So that conflict actually led to an improved relationship. And this is encouraging. I think a lot of times when we see conflict, we can kind of get discouraged and be like, oh man, like this conflict or this relationship with this client's never going to be the same. This is kind of, it's downhill from here. But that's not always the case. And I think if we navigate conflict appropriately and effectively, then a lot of times that conflict is actually going to lead to a better relationship with the client. Some examples. Maybe you find a friction point in your process. This brings up some conflict. And now that you found this conflict, you know that you need to fix that friction point. That's a great example. Another one would be realizing your client doesn't have visibility into tasks on a project. And then, I can think of an example here. We had this specific issue, and we created a way for the client to have visibility into the progress on each task. And so that not only helped our relationship with that client, but then we were able to take what we learned from that client and implement it with other clients, making those future relationships with other clients even better. Another example, potential here, is a client complains about how much you're charging them. This conflict comes up, and what does this tell you? It tells you that you should explain the value you're providing more clearly. So you have this conflict, you've realized what it's telling you. What do you do about it? You maybe develop a pitch or, a specific approach, and say, once you have developed that pitch, you're not only going to be able to communicate more clearly the value that you provide to that specific client, but you're going to be able to go and talk with future clients and explain the value that you're providing and justify the cost that you're charging. And who knows, maybe even down the road, as you get better at realizing the value and explaining the value that you create and provide, you'll be able to charge even more. So this little conflict actually just led, down the road to you being able to bring up your rates and charge more. So that's empathizing. Step 3 is to be generous. So now that you are able to see from your client's perspective, you need to give them the benefit of the doubt in as many areas as possible. You have to be generous with giving the benefit of the doubt. When the client causes an issue, this is really, really important. When clients cause an issue, do not let that issue, that thing, frame your entire perspective of the client. This is so easy to do. And why? This is a key takeaway for you guys. If you learn kind of one thing about navigating conflict with clients, let this be it. As people, we tend to judge others by their actions and ourselves by our intentions. What does that mean? When we look at something that someone else has done, we are going to judge them not by what they intended to do, but the end result of their actions. And if we put ourselves in their shoes, we tend to think more about our intentions than what we would typically actually do and act out. So think about a caricature artist. If you've ever gotten one of these, or if you've ever been to like an amusement park or a state fair, usually these caricature artists are there. And what they do is they will take, they'll have somebody sit down, you sit down across from the artist, and they've got this paper, that they're painting and drawing on kind of faced away from you. You can just kind of see that they're drawing something and they're looking at you. And so when they get done, they turn it around, and what have they done? They've just magnified the kind of extreme features of your face and of your personality. They'll ask you some questions, and say if you've got a big nose, they will take that nose and they will make it the biggest nose you've ever seen on a person and just put that hunker right there on there. If you've got a big old forehead, they're going to make that forehead probably as big as your entire face in reality, and then put the rest of your face down here. They're expanding and judging you based on a specific characteristic, basically the external. And it's kind of a funny, example here, but really this is kind of what happens when we judge people typically. And so if we know this about ourselves, then we can give the client the possibility that their intentions may have actually been similar to what ours would have been if we were in their shoes. And this is really, really important. Their actions don't always correctly represent their intentions, and neither do ours. So we have to always, always keep that in mind and be generous with this perspective. So that's be generous. Number 4 is to be curious. This is kind of the the fun part where we can start to resolve the conflict at hand. So at this point, if you haven't already talked with your client, you definitely should. You should sit down with the client, have a meeting, have a call, whatever it is. If you have the privilege of, sitting down in a room with them, that's even better. It's way easier to manage, resolve conflict when you're face to face with someone. So at this point, if you haven't already had a conversation, have one. And while you're having this conversation, be very intentionally curious about their perspective on the issue. How do you do that? You ask a ton of questions, and then you also need to be open to their answers. I think a lot of times it's really easy for us to ask a lot of questions, but it's even harder for us to accept the answers that we're getting. Sometimes answers to questions are hard. And so this is where humility really, really comes into play. We have to be humble enough to accept the answers and accept the perspective that this person is providing us. Really key here, remember this: forgiveness is a one-player game. It's easy to forgive someone, or it's hard to forgive someone, but it's a one-player game. Somebody does something against you, you forgive them, that's it, it's over. Reconciliation is a two-player game. So it takes both parties, you and the client, working together to navigate the conflict at hand. Reconciliation is a two-player game. It takes two people. So you need to ask a lot of questions. You need to care about the client's perspective, and then you need to work together to solve the issue at hand. And don't get upset if the client doesn't want to participate in reconciliation. We know it takes two people, and the only part that you can play is to initiate and to be the second piece of that reconciliation. Then it's up to the client whether they participate in that reconciliation or not. And so don't be upset if they don't participate. At this point, it's probably best to just move on. It may look like finishing the project and just not working with that client again. Or maybe if it's extreme enough, you end the project as clean as possible at that point, and then you move on and part ways. So, that's kind of reconciliation in a nutshell there. Another thing to consider when you're being curious is to think long-term, not short-term. So what do we mean by this? What do you want your relationship with this client to look like in 2 years from now, or 5 years, or 10 years from now? Do you want to still be working with them? Do you want to have multiple projects kind of built up with this client? Do you want to have referred them, or have them referred several clients to you? If so, you probably want to navigate this conflict well. Do you want to have referred clients to them? Maybe they're a company that, people that come to you have an application for. They could be referrals out to that company. And so think about these things. Think long-term, not short-term. Short-term, it's easy to get up in the weeds and, get caught up in the feels of the conflict. But think long-term, what do I want this relationship to look like in 2 to 5 years? An easy way to kind of visualize this is to think in facts, not details. So the fact is, this happened. I don't want to get in the weeds about it. I don't need to. The fact is, this happened, and how do we get past it? So think in facts, not details. If you do want these things to happen, 5 years down the road, you want to be working with this client and have all these projects and maybe have referrals between you two, then you should approach the conflict with those things in mind, knowing that this conflict is just temporary and your relationship will grow stronger because of it. So that is being curious. That's managing conflict. I hope this is helpful. Let's jump into a couple stories from our team. I want to give a shout out to Maggie, our incredible lead project manager. She does a ton for us at Finsweet. She handed me a couple stories that we'll share with also approach and how we actually solved these stories. So we had a long-term kind of recurring client who sent over Figma files for a site redesign, and since they were a returning client, we already had a developer assigned to the project. The timeline for this was about 5 calendar weeks. The scope was 17 pages from Figma files to be developed and then given over with, QA and all that kind of stuff included. So 17 pages was the scope. We put a contract together and got started on the project. 1 week before the website was scheduled to go live, the our Finsweet developer, had a call with the client and found out that there were an additional 38 pages on top of those 17 pages that were on the old website that they needed to be built in this new website. So this was kind of the first, we were hearing of it. And it would be using new components, which were in this new design. So the client was adamant that it all needed to happen before going live, and the dev came back to Maggie in this case with that information, asking for, what to do next. So here's how Maggie solved the problem. We spoke with the developer and confirmed that it was possible to build those pages out before the website went live. So we provided a solution. And then we told the client that these pages were not included previously in the scope, which was due to miscommunication on both teams, and that we'd be happy to develop them before the deadline. So we admitted some fault. Okay, maybe there was some miscommunication. It wasn't just us, it was also you guys. No worries, we're not going to get into the details. Here's the fact of it, and what are we going to do about it? So since these are out of scope, we will have to send an additional invoice. And guess what? The client agreed to move forward. They agreed to the additional invoice, and they launched with those additional 38 pages on time with their launch, and they were super happy that we managed to build everything. So a couple things that we did here. We listened to the problem. This was good listening. We addressed the cause of the problem. We practiced empathy. And then we presented a solution that would ensure client satisfaction. So we had a client first, or a client centric mindset. So that's a really cool story. Another one Maggie shared with me. Once Maggie took over a project, the client reached out personally saying that there was some disorganization on their team, which had led to miscommunication back and forth with the developer, missed deadlines, and, ultimately an unfinished project. So they weren't happy with the results of their past collaboration and were hoping for things to work better from now on. So they brought us a situation and set their expectations of, this is, we want this to work better moving forward. So we asking for a recommendation of next steps. This is kind of the solution that Maggie put in place. So the first is we started clear communication between the client and our team by establishing a designated point of contact on both sides, so on our side and the client side, to ensure that no miscommunication occurred. So one of the big issues early on that they brought to us was miscommunication. So we said, okay, we'll take that fact and we will deliver a solution. Here are the designated people on both sides, our team as well as the client, that need to be kind of that main point of contact. Good listening and empathy. The next thing we did was we included regular check-ins and daily Slack updates on the project's progress. So this is a very, very easy thing to implement, and it provides a ton of value in terms of avoiding future potential conflict. So this was good teamwork between us and the client. And then the third thing we did was establish a clear plan and scope during the kickoff call. So this is our first kind of initial call with the client, kicking off the project, and we established those rules of engagement. So we listened to what their needs were and catered to their needs, practicing empathy and setting out these guidelines for how we would move forward successfully. Well, that's a wrap. Thank you guys so much for joining. If you enjoyed this content, please like the video, leave a comment of whatever you liked, and subscribe. We will see you in the next one.